Greetings. The question of the origin of Germanic tribes, the localization of their ancestral homeland, and the mechanisms of the formation of their ethno-cultural community remains one of the most complex and debated problems of European proto-history. Over the centuries, scientific discourse around this topic has evolved from romantic constructions and politically colored theories to strict analytical models, relying on the cross-analysis of archaeological, linguistic, and more recently, paleogenetic data. At the center of this scientific issue lies the Jastorf Culture, an archaeological phenomenon of the pre-Roman Iron Age, traditionally viewed as the material reflection of the early stage of the Germanic ethnos' development. And it is precisely this culture that we will discuss today. But before we do, I strongly ask those who haven't done so yet to subscribe to the channel. After all, this is the only thing that helps my channel grow. The foundation of the scientific understanding of the Jastorf culture was laid by the prominent German archaeologist Gustav Schwantes. In his programmatic work, The Oldest Urn Cemeteries, near Uelzen and Lüneburg, published in 1911, Schwantes systematically categorized materials from Iron Age burial grounds in Lower Saxony for the first time, specifically the archaeological site near the village of Jastorf. The researcher noted that the material culture of this region differed radically from synchronous antiquities of more southern territories, where rich burials of Celtic cultures, Hallstatt and La Tène, dominated. Schwantes proposed a detailed chronological scheme that divided the culture's development into three successive stages: Jastorf proper, Ripdorf, and Seedorf. A peculiarity of Schwantes' approach was not only the typology of ceramics and metal objects, but also an attempt to reconstruct the spirit of the culture. He characterized the Jastorf culture with the term Nüchternheit, which can be translated as sobriety, prudence, or utilitarianism. This characteristic was based on the analysis of the burial rite. There, unlike the lavish Celtic burials with chariots and gold ornaments, the bearers of the Jastorf culture practiced cremation, placing the ashes in simple urns, often covered with a bowl or a flat stone, and buried them in large, flat, moundless cemeteries, known as urn fields. The inventory was emphatically modest and consisted mainly of simple iron pins, belt hooks, and rare fibulae. Schwantes saw this poverty not as a sign of cultural decline, but as a conscious choice reflecting the specific social ethics of the early Germanic peoples. A key aspect in the discussion about the origin of the Jastorf culture is the question of its genesis. Was it the result of the migration of a new population, or did it arise based on local traditions? Let's figure it out. Understanding the processes that led to the emergence of the Jastorf culture is impossible without analyzing the dramatic climatic changes that occurred in Europe at the turn of the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. Specifically, between approximately 850 and 600 BC, the Northern Hemisphere experienced a sharp cooling, which in scientific literature has been termed the Homeric minimum. Data from the analysis of carbon and beryllium isotopes in lake sediments in Germany and peat bogs in the Netherlands record a sharp decrease in solar activity. The cooling of the atmosphere led to a shortening of the growing season, which critically affected the yield of heat-loving crops characteristic of the Bronze Age, for example, millet. Furthermore, a sharp increase in precipitation caused a rise in groundwater levels. Consequently, large areas of lowland lands in northern Germany and Denmark turned into swamps. The consequence of these climatic changes was an ecological crisis that struck the most densely populated regions of northern Europe, including Jutland. Archaeological data record significant depopulation of the northern part of the Jutland Peninsula during the transition to the Iron Age. Traditional farming models, based on extensive agriculture and livestock grazing in open spaces, became ineffective under conditions of soil waterlogging. At the same time, the sandy soils of the Lüneburg Heath, Schleswig-Holstein, and western Mecklenburg proved more resilient to excessive moisture due to better drainage. It is precisely here, into the zone of the future core of the Jastorf culture, that the demographic center of gravity likely shifted from the north. Representatives of the Nordic Bronze Age culture, or Scandinavian Bronze Age, from Jutland were forced to move south into the basin of the lower Elbe and the Lüneburg Heath. They brought with them the traditions of urnfield burials and specific social norms. However, unlike a classic military invasion, this resettlement had the character of gradual infiltration into a sort of ecological refuge. It must be added that the territories where the migrants arrived were not an empty wasteland. Developed late Bronze Age cultures already existed here, which were also part of the broad circle of the Nordic Bronze Age, but had their own local peculiarities. Thus, the autochthonous population of the region between the Elbe and the Aller is attributed to the Lüneburg group, whose representatives practiced burial in mounds, tumuli, and the Wesenstedt group, characterized by biconical urns and the use of swan's neck pins. It was the bearers of the Wesenstedt culture who were the aboriginals with whom the migrants from the north encountered. Since both groups, the Jutland and the Wesenstedt, belonged to the same metacultural circle of the Nordic Bronze, their interaction was more in the nature of symbiosis and consolidation rather than total extermination. Thus, the Jastorf culture essentially became the result of the crystallization of these related groups, who united for survival in the new climatic conditions. Now, while archaeology operates with artifacts, paleogenetics allows us to trace the biological history of the populations that created them. Research from 2023-2025 has made a real breakthrough in understanding the demographic processes of the Iron Age, providing independent evidence that confirms or corrects old archaeological hypotheses. Specifically, a study published in January 2024 in the journal Nature by a group of scientists led by Morten Allentoft is of fundamental importance for understanding the biological origins of the Jastorf culture bearers. Although the main focus of the work is concentrated on Neolithic changes, its conclusions regarding the late Bronze and early Iron Ages are critical for this video. Allentoft and his colleagues demonstrated that the gene pool of the population of modern Denmark and northern Germany, which became the foundation for later Germanic peoples, formed as a result of a massive migration of carriers of steppe ancestry at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. Importantly, after this period of turbulent changes, beginning from the late Neolithic, genetic stability was established in the region. The genomes of individuals from the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age demonstrate high kinship and continuity. This discovery provides powerful biological support for the archaeological theory of the autochthonous development of the Jastorf culture from the substrate of the Nordic Bronze Age. The genetic profile of the Iron Age in Scandinavia is characterized by a specific mixture, a high proportion of the steppe component mixed with the genes of Neolithic farmers and Western hunter-gatherers. The absence of signs of a massive influx of a new population during the transition to the Iron Age testifies that the Jastorf culture was a product of the internal evolution of the local population, and not external conquest. So, as I have already said, the genesis of the Jastorf culture cannot be viewed as a complete break with the past. It grew on the soil of the Nordic Bronze Age, which had dominated Scandinavia and northern Germany for centuries. The culture of the Scandinavian Bronze Age was a phenomenon based on the intensive import of metal from Central and Southern Europe, as the region itself had no deposits of these resources. The wealth of burials of the Scandinavian Bronze Age culture, the sophistication of weapons and jewelry, testify to the existence of a powerful elite that controlled trade routes and redistributed prestige goods. With the onset of the Iron Age in Central Europe, a geopolitical reorientation of trade networks took place. Celtic centers in the south began to orient themselves toward the Mediterranean, and traditional routes of supplying bronze to the north fell into decay. This led to a metal famine in the north. The elite of the Scandinavian Bronze Age culture lost the basis of their power, control over prestige metal. Isolation from southern sources of raw materials forced the population of the North German plain to turn their attention to local resources. The region was rich in bog iron ore, deposits of which became more accessible precisely due to the processes of swamp formation. However, it must be said that the transition to iron metallurgy was not instantaneous. but a gradual process of adapting technologies borrowed from the South through contacts with the Hallstatt culture. Unlike bronze, which required long-distance trade and elite control, iron was a democratic metal. Raw materials were available in almost every swamp, and the technology of extraction in bloomery furnaces could be implemented at the level of a separate community. This undermined the economic base of the old aristocracy and facilitated the formation of a more egalitarian society, characteristic of the Jastorf culture. Studies of settlements in Germany and Denmark have also allowed for the reconstruction of the social organization of space. Excavations of the settlement of Hode in western Jutland, conducted by Steen Vass, are standard for understanding the late phase of the culture. The village was clearly organized and surrounded by a common fence. Inside, there were about 27 individual farmsteads. Each farmstead consisted of a main longhouse and several smaller outbuildings enclosed by their own fence. This testifies to a high degree of privacy and the concept of property. One farmstead stood out significantly in size and complexity of construction. Archaeologists interpret it as the residence of a possible chieftain or community elder. Ceramics from this courtyard were of higher quality, and the buyer was calculated for a larger number of livestock. The settlement of Feddersen Vierde, near Cuxhaven, demonstrates adaptation to life in coastal marshes. To avoid flooding during tides, houses were located on artificially heaped mounds, wharton or terps. The houses were arranged radially around a central square, indicating the presence of centralized management and collective decision-making. A craftsman's house was also discovered here, where metal, wood, and bone were processed, testifying to the emergence of a class of professional artisans. But research in Vleugelen revealed the phenomenon of wandering settlements. That is, when the soil around the village was depleted or buildings became uninhabitable, the community moved the settlement a few hundred meters to the side. And this, according to scientists, was intended to ensure the recovery of ecosystems. So, the traditional interpretation of the Jastorf culture, based on Schwantes' concept of poverty, painted a picture of an egalitarian society of equal peasant warriors. However, modern data force a review of this view. The dynamics of social development show gradual stratification, and if in the early Jastorf period, burial grounds indeed demonstrated relative homogeneity of inventory, when most burials contained only an urn and one or two simple fibulae, then by the late stage, that is, the Seedorf stage, signs of property differentiation appear. In settlements like Hode, large courtyards stand out that controlled greater resources. Princely burials also appear. Although classic princely graves of the Lubsau type are characteristic of the early Roman period, their roots may reach back to the late pre-Roman period. For instance, near Hitzacker in Lower Saxony, a burial was excavated where Roman bronze vessels, silver cups decorated with scenes from the Iliad, Celtic swords, gold jewelry, and items of horse harness were found. Also, an entire cemetery with elite sections was found in Husby, near Flensburg. Klaus Raditz found warrior burials here in the 1960s, with full equipment and imported bronze cauldrons and situlae, which were used as urns for ashes. This is a characteristic feature of princely status, the use of expensive Roman vessels in the burial rite. Speaking of religion in general, it must be said that one of the most striking points of intersection between Jastorf archaeology and historical sources is the cult of the goddess Nerthus, described by Tacitus in his Germania. The Roman historian tells of a union of 7 tribes, among whom were the Angles and Verini, who worshipped Mother Earth on an island in the ocean, performing ritual washings of her chariot in a sacred lake, after which the servants were drowned. The archaeological correlate of this cult comprises numerous finds of sacrifices in peat bogs of northern Germany and Jutland, the area of the late Jastorf culture. The most famous bog bodies, such as the Tolland man, were likely victims sacrificed to deities of fertility. It is important that the tradition of sacred bogs demonstrates continuity of use from the Jastorf period right up to the Viking Age, confirming the continuity of cult places. Wooden anthropomorphic idols found in bogs such as the pair of figures from Brock and Schleswig-Holstein, belong directly to the Jastorf context. These are male and female figures carved from oak, which likely depict a divine couple, possibly early forms of the Vanir, Njord, and Nerthus. And this may indicate the existence of a developed pantheon, even before Roman influence. If the cult of Nerthus is connected with fertility, then the discovery of the boat in the Hjortspring bog marks the beginning of a new religious paradigm, the cult of war. This is the oldest known mass sacrifice of weapons in the north. A war canoe, shields, spears, and chainmail captured from a defeated enemy were thrown into the bog. This event, which happened in the very heart of the Jastorf world, testifies to the formation of a concept that would later become central to the cult of Odin, the dedication of an enemy army to the god of war. Lotte Hedegaard, in her work Iron Age Myth and Materiality, argues that such finds prove the existence of a long duration of Germanic cosmological structures. She traces a direct line from shamanistic practices and the animal style of the Iron Age to the myths of the Edda, asserting that the Jastorf era was a time of crystallization for these beliefs. Thus, the religion of the Jastorf culture was not primitive animism, but was instead a complex system combining agrarian cults, such as the cult of Nerthus, ancestor worship through cremation, and the birth of a military ideology that would essentially become dominant in the Germanic world. Generally, the Jastorf culture did not exist in a vacuum. To the south of its range, the powerful Celtic La Tène culture flourished, exerting significant cultural and technological influence on its northern neighbors. These contacts became especially intensive in the later phase of Jastorf, Ripdorf. In this period, the severe style of the early Jastorf begins to change. Local craftsmen actively borrow Celtic metalworking technologies and costume elements, specifically fibulae of the Middle La Tène scheme. However, this was not blind copying. Jastorf artisans reworked Celtic models, creating their own distinctive forms. For example, locally produced fibulae often combined La Tène construction with archaic decor or specific Jastorf elements, such as ball-shaped thickenings on the bow. This process of Laténisation of the North had not only a material dimension. Lothar Killian and other researchers suggest that the Jastorf elite also adopted elements of Celtic social organization and military affairs. This testifies that the Celtic world was perceived by the Germanic peoples as a source of prestige, although they retained their ethnic distinctiveness. The first historically recorded exit of Germanic peoples onto the arena of European history was the migration of the Cimbri and Teutones at the end of the 2nd century BC, which ended in their clash with Rome. Ancient sources point to their origin from the Jutland Peninsula. Jess Martins, in his article, The Migration of the Cimbri, Connecting History and Archaeology, conducted a detailed correlation of historical evidence with archaeological data. He points out that exactly in the period preceding the migration, signs of crisis are observed in Jutland. The disappearance of many settlements, changes in the structure of land use, which may indicate climatic troubles or overpopulation. The most weighty archaeological proof of migration is the spread of specific types of Jastorf material culture to the south, along the probable route of the tribe's movement. Martins and other researchers identify finds of ceramics and metal products that have direct analogies in Jutland. These are not traces of trade expansion, but markers of the presence of mobile groups of people. Martins pays special attention to the famous silver Gundestrup cauldron found in a peat bog in Jutland. Stylistic analysis indicates its manufacture by masters of the Thracian or Celtic circle. The appearance of such a unique imported object in the very center of the Jastorf range is interpreted as a consequence of the Cimbri campaign. It could have been a war trophy, a diplomatic gift, or a sacral object brought by a part of the tribe that returned to their homeland. This closes the historical circle, connecting the archaeology of the North with events in the Mediterranean. The Przeworsk culture, which occupied the territory of modern Poland, is traditionally associated with the tribal union of the Lugii and the Vandals. The question of its origin was for a long time a subject of discussion between autochthonists and migrationists. Modern research by Teresa Dąbrowska and Andrzej Michałowski convincingly proves the decisive role of the Jastorf component in the genesis of the Przeworsk culture. Researchers distinguish the so-called Guben group in the interfluve of the Oder and Gneiss, which demonstrates the purest Jastorf traits. Ceramics of the Guben group have direct analogies with pottery of the lower Elbe, which testifies to the physical resettlement of a group of people from the Jastorf core. This theory explains the presence of Germanic elements in Eastern Europe long before the arrival of the Goths, and demonstrates that the Jastorf culture was a mother culture, not only for Western but also for Eastern Germanic peoples. Instead of a conclusion, I want to note that attempts to directly link the Jastorf culture with specific tribes, such as the Teutones, Cimbri, or Lombards, mentioned by Tacitus or Ptolemy, are quite difficult. Most ancient sources describe the situation in the 1st century AD, whereas the Jastorf culture formed 500 years earlier. However, there is still a consensus that the Jastorf community was the root from which tribal unions of the Elbe Germanic peoples, particularly the Suebi and Lombards, later separated. Friends, thank you for watching this video to the end. Like and subscribe to the channel. Good night and good luck.